I hope your decks are sufficiently low because we are back to talk about Trusted Sources, the newest episode in the third season of Star Trek Lower Decks, aka Episode 9. If you are new here, spoilers are ahead, so consider yourself warned. Now let's go. So this episode to me felt a bit like a throwback and not necessarily in the best of ways. I'm not sure why, but it just kind of seemed like many of the characters were acting much more season 1-y than I would have expected at this point in season 3. We actually don't get all that much in the way of the normal lower deckers aside from Mariner, because the crux of the situation here is that Captain Freeman has implemented a new mission type, new parameters for the California class. It's what she calls a swing by mission, and this is basically a follow-up mission to planets and societies and whatnot that have already had contact with the Federation in some manner or other, but for whatever reason, they had been left alone for the intervening years. So this is going to be the test drive of that, her first proof of concept, I suppose, that this is an actual mission type that would benefit both Starfleet, the Federation, and work well with the California class. The first choice of this mission is the planet Ornara, and this is a planet from what most consider to be the greatest episode of TNG, Symbiosis. You know, it's the one that featured the return of the actor who had played Kirk's son, and it revolved around a planet that was hooked on drugs by their neighbors. This is the episode that also single-handedly put Will Wheaton's acting skills onto full display with his speculative conversation about drugs with Yar. Truly, truly inspiring stuff. In honor of this new Starfleet venture, they also decide to send an FNN correspondent to accompany the Cerritos on this first one-of-a-kind mission. This sends Captain Freeman into a freakout. She thinks that her crew and her ship are incredibly unprofessional compared to Starfleet standards, and that she really needs them to shape up if she's going to sell this thing and look good on the news. I understand this is something that's been established as one of her traits, on more than one occasion, might I add, but I thought that on all of those occasions, it kind of ended with her learning a lesson, growing a little bit, having a little more maturity and growth in her characteristics, and the fact that we just keep jumping back to this seemingly like there's no growth to her character whatsoever. I don't know, it feels like we're just coming back to it a little often. And I understand this is an animated show. It's sort of episodic with very little serialization, and that's the type of thing that would happen back in the day. Characters would go through growth in an episode and then never address it anymore, and it just does seem like a lot of what's going on here is a throwback to less evolved versions of our characters. And of course, Captain Freeman's biggest pet peeve here, as it normally is her daughter, Beckett Mariner, as well as the rest of our normal Lower Decks cast. She decides that they are screw-ups, they're incapable, they're not trustworthy, and they really, really need to go get shoved to the corner so they don't screw up her stuff. That seems very regressive to me, especially after all the things these characters have accomplished over the last few seasons, and the more mature stuff that they've done on the ship, the more responsibility and expertise they've gained. And it just seems like they've climbed up the ladder a little bit just to be thrown back to the fish like this. Thrown back to the fish. Thrown back to the wolves? I think that might be more how you say it. I guess I can't be too hypercritical here because it did allow the episode to take place, and based upon the ending, I do think that there might be more of a theatrical bent to what's going on, but I'll get to that in a bit. The FFN reporter conducts a bunch of interviews with higher level members of the crew leading up to the mission down to Ornara, and she also accompanies them down to the planet when the away team beams down to figure out what's going on. To their surprise, they discover that somehow, to everyone's shock, the planet has completely recovered from their drug-addled situation of 17 years prior, and they've built themselves up into, I guess you could call it a thriving society, but they're very, very overly concerned with fitness, which they think of as, well, maybe this is just our new addiction. Of course, Ransom absolutely loves this and has a nice little back and forth with one of the characters, like, oh, how much do you bench? Oh, it's not about how much you can bench, it's just about getting out there and doing it. I guess that was a good little character moment for Ransom. This means that basically they have no real need to do this swing by because there's nothing there for them to accomplish, so it looks like the mission might actually be a bust until they decide, you know what, let's stop by and check out Brekka, the neighboring planet, the one that was actually dealing all the drugs. Back on the ship, Mariner decides to break orders and sneak into the FNN interview sessions to basically let them know some of the things that go on around here. At least that's her wording. Ransom overhears this and he is not amused. Obviously, we think that this is going to be Mariner going up to her old tricks that she used to do, sabotage the ship, talk bad about it, basically tell them all the things that Captain Freeman doesn't want them to hear. And herein lies another large problem I have with this episode. Let me give you my problems before I tell you why they could swing me around based on stuff that could happen in the future. Ultimately, the FNN anchor comes out with some pretty unflattering opinions of the ship and the crew, and especially the captain. Freeman is livid at this revelation and calls Mariner into her office, where she just completely loses it. She ends up kicking her off the ship to Starbase 80, that joke we've been going over the last few seasons about it's the worst place to work in Starfleet. And it's not a joke. This is actually happening this time. The entire crew, minus Rutherford, Tendi, and Boimler, including Jennifer, including Mariner's own girlfriend, decides to shun her. They all turn their backs on her and believe Captain Freeman. They believe that Beckett Mariner did all these nasty things. And I don't know how to feel about that. I think that's very much of a stretch unless there's something else going on. So she's booted from the ship, the real FNN broadcast airs, and it's revealed that Mariner actually only said good things. It was in fact the other interview subjects that had all the inflammatory stuff to say. This was pretty telegraphed in my opinion, so I don't believe it was supposed to be a shock to us, the audience, but if it was pretty easy to spot. This absolutely does not work for me, assuming it's supposed to be a literal interpretation of events, and that's all. I do have to assume there is a secondary plot going on here, something along the lines of what we saw with Picard and later Riker in the TNG two-parter Gambit. We also had a similar storyline in Voyager with Tom Paris. Basically, they were pretending they were at odds with Starfleet, have a lot of bad behavior, get kicked off the ship or something along those lines because they were going on some form of undercover mission. I can't guarantee that's what's going on here, but it definitely feels like if this isn't the case, this episode is really setting all of our characters back 20 or 30 spaces, and I do not enjoy that if that's not the case. For the sake of the benefit of the doubt, which I do believe this show is mostly earned at this point, I'll delay my final judgment until we get that reveal, assuming there actually is a reveal coming. As for the rest of the plot, they did indeed continue on with a mission to Brekka. They discovered that the planet has not fared nearly as well as their neighbor. There is in fact currently a Breen occupation force when they beam down. They barely managed to get off the planet alive. In fact, Ransom actually sees someone get vaporized in front of him. It's very cool to see the Breen again. I actually really thought that we might be getting them in Picard Season 3, but I guess it's nice to see them here instead. Maybe we'll still get them there. They managed to make it back to the ship barely, where the ship is getting beat up and walloped by the Breen ships. Cool to see them in action again, too. When suddenly an unknown Starfleet vessel flies in to save the day. Takes out the Breen just in time, and it turns out this is a new Texas-class starship, one of 3, might I add, created to be an entirely automated vessel. This was part of the Admiral's plan all along, and this bad boy was sent out as some sort of test mission. And I know this might be nitpicky, but does it seem like the show has started to rely very heavily on the whole savior coming in at the last moment to save the day trope? I'm sure this happens in a lot of media, especially types of shows like this, but it's just sticking out to me at the moment that there's been this exact same situation on several different occasions on this show, and it's just kind of becoming a, how do we get out of this situation? We'll have a random ship fly in and save the day. Why not? Anywho, the last scene of the episode has Mariner having left Starfleet completely. She's hitching a ride with Petra Aberdeen, who was that woman she met back during that Starfleet recruitment drive episode. You know, the one that was basically Vash from TNG. She's a space archaeologist rogue type. And I can only hope this helps tie into the whole undercover plot that I made reference to earlier, because if it doesn't, I really don't know where they're going here. All in all, I do think this was an interesting episode, if not entirely groundbreaking in any way. Like I said, most of my final feelings will just have to come after things are concluded and resolved, and I can look back on how well this episode did as far as setup for that final payoff. After a couple more conceptually heavy episodes, like the ones we got the last couple of weeks, this may not have been the worst idea for an episode, if it's going to actually lead into something that's more of a mind-blowing payoff down the road. I guess we'll have to see on that. One other thing I did want to mention, it is conceivable that some of this undercover stuff that I'm kind of looking at here might tie into the fact that a couple of episodes ago we saw that dead transporter clone Boimler was actually not dead. He was joining Section 31. It could be that there's some grand conspiracy going on, and I would really, really hope that's the case because some of our characters were acting far, far, far out of character this episode, and that's really the only way I could see around it, unless this episode was taking place out of continuity for some reason. But what did you think? Did you find this episode to be more than I seem to be giving it credit for? And what are your thoughts on this show and this season overall? Leave all of those and everything else you'd like to down below, especially if that includes a like and subscribe. But until next time, computer and program.